What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and with the multiverse coming back in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or I guess maybe returning for the first time, I don't really know how we quantify that, but with the multiverse existing now, anything that can happen will happen. And I thought it'd be kind of fun to do things like Phase 4 and do a character explanation on like Mangog, on the possibility that we might see a character like that in the MCU in Phase 4. I don't know if we will. Technically, the Mangog has appeared in the MCU, or at least is tied to the MCU, but only because of the Thor God of Thunder video game in 2011, but there's two things about that. One, that video game sucked, so none of us consider it to be in continuity. And two, it's not truly Mangog, so we're gonna do a character explanation here and just kind of see how you guys respond to it. The Mangog first appeared in Marvel Comics with Thor issue number 154 back in 1968 and was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Now here's one of the things to understand about the creation of the Mangog. First and foremost, he does have a definitive origin, but later on, writers like Jerry Conway, Roy Thomas, people like that, will actually shift it up, especially when we get to Thor number 195 and really 196 and the stories coming after that. But Stan Lee, as most of you guys know, was really big on allegories. And so the creation of Mangog was done for the purpose to kind of introduce this concept of what hate really represents, right? Absolute hatred, absolute anger, that it doesn't take on any kind of an attractive form, that it takes on a very angry form. And we know this from an interview Stan Lee did with Tomorrow's Publishing, where he was talking about the creation of Mangog and said he wanted a being that basically personified the ugliness of hate. So people, when they looked at his comics, had to look at what it meant or see what it meant to actually embody hate and all the chaos and danger that it basically brings in. Of course, kind of paraphrasing here, but nonetheless, the whole idea of the introduction of Mangog actually came out of an existing story that involved a character named Ulik the Troll. Now, those of you guys who are familiar with Thor at the moment, you guys have probably heard of Ulik the Troll. The reality is he's not nearly as prominent as he used to be. That's one of the things to know, is that a lot of these characters that you see in the Thor mythos kind of off and on, right? Looking at characters like Ulik the Troll, people like Hela even, or possibly even Surtur, they were huge mainstays of the Thor mythos back during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But over time, they started dropping off in popularity as Marvel made way for other stories, some of which were more cerebral, some of which were more basic but action-packed. But regardless, a lot of those characters began to drop off. But when you look at the character of Ulik the Troll, the way this played out is that in Thor issue number 153, he had found himself in a fight with Thor, which basically took place in a realm called Nornheim. Now, ultimately, Ulik the Troll was defeated and then cast down into a place called the Abyss of Shadows. Now, the Abyss of Shadows was essentially a death sentence, right? Like if you fell down into it, that was essentially the end of you. But along the way, Ulik the Troll actually latched onto an edge and found himself in front of something called the Cave of Ages. Now, Stan Lee actually ended up taking a page out of his own book. And what I mean by that is when Ulik the Troll gets to the Cave of Ages, he discovers this giant rock with an inscription on the front. And the inscription reads, "Let no living being disturb what lies within by order of Imperial Odin." And this was basically Stan Lee referencing his own work from 3 years prior in 1965 with X-Men issue number 12 and the introduction of the Juggernaut, right? A lot of you guys know that origin story. Cain Marko sees the Crimson Gem of Sidorak and it has an inscription. The inscription, of course, reads, "Whosoever touches this gem shall possess the power of the Crimson Bands of Sidorak. Henceforth, you who read these words shall become forevermore a human juggernaut." So it's basically Stan Lee just kind of building up on his own work, which I think is kind of a cool thing here. But Ulik the Troll basically looks at this from the perspective of saying, okay, basically I can ally myself with this being, whoever this happens to be behind this thing. And if it was locked away by Odin, it must be something exceedingly powerful, which is certainly capable enough to destroy Asgard and everybody on it, since of course Ulik the Troll was always looking to bring down Asgard. And so what ends up happening is when he frees or really unlocks this kind of rock, that it leads to the Mangog popping up. Now, this is when the origin of the Mangog gets a little finicky, because when he first shows up here, he says, "Let the universe tremble, the Mangog lives again. I have one goal, one aim, one destiny, to destroy him who crushed the invasion of my race." After which he denies Ulik the Troll any chance of working together, basically stating that his whole goal is to essentially destroy Odin, any of his followers, and even goes as far as to say that he's a foe of all those who live, right? So his aspirations to inflict the destruction of things extend beyond Asgard and seemingly to all of reality itself, overcomes Ulik, and then just kind of goes from there. Now, once you actually get to Mangog himself, who launches an invasion against Asgard, this takes place at the time that Odin is in the Odin Sleep. Now, for those of you guys who are not familiar with that, the Odin Sleep was basically introduced to Marvel Comics as a way for Marvel to have this concept where sometimes Asgard would be defenseless. Because back during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Odin was really given to us as just kind of like this nigh unstoppable entity. Now, there were a few stories here and there. For example, when you had the third celestial host, where the Celestials came down to Earth, and then you had like the destroyer armor assembled by Odin and the rest of the Sky Fathers, which was obliterated. You had a few instances like that where it was shown that Odin was not nigh unstoppable. But for the most part, in comparison to most all the other stories that you saw, Odin was this being that just couldn't really be defeated by seemingly anybody on on Earth. It would take an insane level of power to pull that off. And so where Ulik the Troll and Mangog basically work together temporarily in order for Mangog to basically make his escape, one of the things that was kind of crazy here is that Ulik comes to the realization that in freeing Mangog, he took off more than he could handle, and even goes as far as to say, better I had perished than to set the Mangog free. He says, in all the spinning cosmos, there can be no safety now, right? Which basically said, really gave it to us as the reader, that once Mangog is out, there's really no stopping him. And that was one of the things that Stan Lee solidified right off the bat when it came to the introduction of Mangog, right? This guy goes forward into Asgard and just lays waste to everyone. Like, no one's able to stop him, right? I mean, it takes whole teams, right? It takes all these Asgardian warriors to do what they can to fend off against Mangog, and he overcomes them all, and then eventually makes his way into the inner chamber of where Odin resides with the intention of attaining the Odin sword. Now, one of the things that had been hit on a lot in Marvel Comics at the time, to kind of sidetrack from this for a second, especially when you went and you read the Tales of Asgard stories by Jack Kirby, which were basically backup features in the old Thor stories, is that if anybody ever drew the Odin sword, then it would basically lead to Ragnarok, right? It would start the cycle of essentially destroying the entirety of Asgard and the end of everything. And Marvel toyed with that a lot. It wasn't really until you got to Walt Simonson's Thor run that you saw the first real indication of Ragnarok actually happening in Marvel, and then of course you saw it in the Thor disassembled storyline. Up until this point, and even during this story itself, it was always one of these things where it was like, is it going to be Ragnarok this time? And then of course, basically the day was saved and it wasn't. But Thor himself is overcome by the power of Mangog. Nothing can really stop this guy. And every single member of like the Warriors 3, right? So Thor's inner circle, all these guys, every Asgardian warrior falls before Mangog. Now this ultimately gets to the point where Mangog himself essentially accesses the Odin sword with the intention of pulling it out and then using it to bring about the end of all Asgardians. Now, of course, as you would expect, Odin basically wakes up and essentially saves the day, and does this by freezing the limbs of Mangog, basically keeping him in place and then revealing the reality of what happened. And this is where his origin, again, kind of circling around to the murkiness of it all. This is when you find out what supposedly actually happened, but yet again, it'll be changed later in Marvel. So the explanation that's given to us by Odin is that instead of him actually killing the entire race of Mangog, instead what had happened is he had taken the entire race, basically all their energy, and put it inside of what was basically a containment unit, which took the form of Mangog and then imprisoned him away. Now, one of the things that was kind of interesting here is that over the years, when you looked at this, Mangog, for the most part, was one of these characters that didn't appear a whole lot, despite being a guy who, in his first appearance, was enough to overpower everybody in Asgard, with the exception of Odin, who basically dissipated his essence across the cosmos. Mangog hasn't appeared all that much. But one of the things that was really a big deal here is that despite being defeated and basically the desire of his hate, right, the existence of this hatred of this alien race for Odin basically being stopped, that Mangog essentially didn't serve any real useful purpose. He wasn't really supposed to exist anymore. But one of the things that happened is that Marvel ended up bringing him back. Now, this of course took place in Thor 195 in 1972, and by this point, the stories had been written by Jerry Conway. Now, I can't really find an interview as to why it is Conway decided to bring the Mangog back, presumably because of the fact that the Mangog, when he was first brought in by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, was of just such an insurmountable force against the Asgardians. It would just be cool to have him back. The problem with this was finding a way to bring him back if the whole idea behind his existence is that the hatred of the alien race that had basically been destroyed or confined by Odin was essentially dissipated, because now there was no need for him anymore. And so what ended up happening is that in 195, Loki actually set Mangog free, and that in turn, Odin offered an explanation to the various Asgardians, and essentially revealed here that the very evil that powered Mangog essentially has to exist, i.e. Mangog is in effect a force of nature. So long as there is evil that exists in the universe, Mangog will continue to exist. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting here, if you sort of read between the lines a little bit, and a lot of this is just kind of based on our interpretation of it, you can essentially look at this idea and state that if Odin had basically defeated or captured or destroyed an alien race and then took their spiritual essence and confined it within what basically became Mangog, that even when they were freed, that he unwittingly created a kind of bond between Mangog and the emotional aspect of hatred, anger, fear, different things along those lines. And so long as those exist, Mangog will always exist. Now, of course, over the course of the story, going into 196 through 197, Mangog did exactly what he did before, which was to absolutely lay waste to the entirety of Asgard. The problem with this is that depending on who you talk to, some people loved the events of In the Shadow of the Mangog, other people hated it, right? It's one of these stories where it kind of splits the community. But one of the things that people cannot really deny is that these early appearances of Mangog had him as an absolute boss, right? This guy would just crush Asgard. And it's one of these things where even in these early stories, it was solidified that Asgard couldn't defeat Mangog on their own, that they grabbed different giants that were out there. They even worked with Hela at one point in time, that there were these different situations where when Mangog showed up, it took basically pulling out all the stops to bring an end to these guys. And it's one of these things where you got these small little moments here and there where, for example, Mangog was powered with the hate of a billion beings, right? Just different things along those lines. But having said that, the confusion that existed in terms of how Mangog could exist with his race having basically been returned and all that kind of stuff was solved in Thor issue number 198 when Jerry Conway took everything and just wrapped it all together, both the work of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby as well as the work of himself, and essentially revealed here that yes, Mangog is powered by the hatred of the beings that were, by all standards of measurement, destroyed. But the important thing here is, despite the fact that they had been returned, they still hated Odin, and so he was still powered by that hate. And so whether or not those beings had basically been destroyed and their hate had essentially manifested in the form of Mangog himself, or they were still alive, that hatred would still exist. And so long as it exists, Mangog would exist. Now, the whole point behind Jerry Conway doing this, again, I couldn't really find a definitive interview, but I kind of have to believe this was the case. The whole point of doing this was to basically create a kind of end run so there'd always be a means by which Mangog could return. And the reason why was because in these early appearances, one of the things that was solidified is that Mangog did have the ability to tap into magical energy, he could shapeshift, so on and so forth, but more than anything, he was just an overwhelming force that could never actually be destroyed. Hence the reason that Odin made the statement that he could never actually destroy Mangog himself, because he basically has to exist. At this point, he's a force of nature. It would take somebody on a much higher level of power who, in all honesty, would not really have any interest in destroying the Mangog. Now, having said all of that, the question that you might find yourself asking here is that if the Mangog was introduced as a credible threat to Asgard, so much so that even Odin was afraid of him and was just kind of this powerhouse, then why did Marvel stop writing stories about it, right? Why didn't he necessarily appear that much? Why is it that he appeared 11 times over the course of those original Thor stories and then just kind of faded into oblivion at basically a fever pitch? The reason for that, and it's one of the things that we've talked about before, is that following 1971, a lot of people point to the Dark Knight Returns at DC Comics as kind of the starting point of the Bronze Age, where stories became darker, more cerebral, focusing more on character-driven stories as opposed to just crazy events happening. I really point more towards 1971 with the night when Stacy died, the first time in really comic book history that you saw an instance where a love interest of a superhero died, not because somebody else killed her in the same way that like Eobard Thawne killed Iris West in the 1970s in the Flash comics, but by the superhero's own failure, which was Spider-Man's mistake. Then that basically changed everything in comics. And so you started seeing things going forward where it was focusing again more on cerebral stories, focusing more on character-driven stories, and less on things like, here comes the Mangog. Not only that, because the Mangog was a character that had been written a certain way by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, as well as Jerry Conway, there wasn't really a whole lot of drive to correct that. There wasn't really a whole lot of drive to write him in a more interesting and intriguing way. And so that's why over the years, if you look at things like Thor Volume 2, issues 21 through 25, or you look at issue number 84, or you go back and you look at the Thunderstrike series, Thunderstrike Volume 2, issue number 5, you have these appearances by Mangog that are small time, right? Where he just kind of pops up for a little bit and then is just almost immediately defeated. And it's always like, well, so long as hatred will endure, I will always endure, and then that's basically it, right? He's just kind of, in a lot of ways, treated like a punching bag. And truth to tell, that pisses off Mangog fans, because while Mangog doesn't really have a lot of fans out there, the fans he does have love him. And it's one of the things where they just kind of get pissed at the idea that Marvel just sort of throws him out there and nothing ever really happens with him, especially because of the fact that he was a guy that scared the piss out of Odin back in the day in Marvel Comics. And so more recently with Mangog, and it's something that we covered under Jason Aaron's Thor run, which I still consider to be the greatest Thor run of all time. But one of the things that had happened more recently is you saw Mangog returning really at the tail end of the series, facing off against Jane Foster. And this wasn't really designed to give us Mangog as we were used to, which was a just massive credible threat that would call together really not just Thor and the Asgardians, but probably a whole host of forces from across the different realms, as well as probably the Avengers on Earth. Instead, it was really more of a story designed to complement and really focus on the character of Jane Foster. That Mangog was given as a way to kind of be a physical manifestation of how much everybody hated Jane Foster, and that her overcoming the Mangog was her overcoming everybody's hatred of her, i.e. Jason Aaron saying, sorry about your luck, but she's not going anywhere. Of course, she did. They basically ended the Thor story, and then she ended up becoming Valkyrie. So, one of the things that I always said during that time is give it a while, Odin's son will go back to being Thor again. Nobody wanted to believe it would happen, but it always does in comics. That's the nature of comics, it's always kind of going in a cyclical pattern. But the important thing here is last we saw Mangog, basically he was thrown into the sun. And whether or not anything significant really comes out of that, we don't know. It's one of these things where Mangog was defeated and then at some point will likely end up coming back, and that's going to be the end of it. But that's one of the things, is that Mangog was always just this incredible hoss of a character who ended up being turned into more or less a plot device and a punching bag for whatever particular story was being written by that particular writer at the time. So again, that kind of happens in Marvel Comics, and it happens a lot more often than you would like to believe, that you have these characters that are introduced as just like these insanely powerful beings, and then are just kind of throwaway characters after that, and just kind of get beat up on, and that's basically it, and they seem like a shadow of their former selves in terms of the power they possess. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.